Hello, everyone. Welcome back to I See What You're Saying, the Disciplined Listening Podcast. I'm Michael Reddington, and today it is my pleasure to welcome back Dave Thompson. Dave's a friend, a colleague, a frequent collaborator, and someone who I'm excited to have back on the show, especially under these circumstances. This is actually part 2 of a home-and-home conversation we ended up having about how communication myths impact conversations in the business world, at home, in the investigations world, and beyond. So Dave, among many things, he's the president of Wicklanders, Olosky and Associates, and he's also the host of the Truth Be Told podcast. So we had the first session of this conversation on his podcast. It came out last week. So on his show, he interviewed me, and I got to talk a lot about the myths and misconceptions I see impacting conversations regularly. And as he was coming up with more and more ideas, we decided it only made sense to make this a home and home. So now this is part 2 of the conversation, where I get to facilitate a little bit with him, and he gets to share many of the myths and misconceptions and roadblocks that he sees people running into and making their conversations so much more difficult than necessary, both in investigations and outside of investigations as well. So, of course, thank you for being here and listening to this show this week. We really appreciate it. But after you listen to this show, click on the link in the show notes, head over to the Truth Be Told podcast, and listen to the first half of our conversation over there. And by the way, that's a great show. It's a great podcast. Dave is somebody that you should be following and learning from anyway. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate it. While you're here, please take a second, like the show, share the show. We'd love to see your feedback. Please subscribe to the show. Dave's going to get into so many cool things today. I'm going to talk about why in many of our conversations, our goal should be to get more information than we already have. And not only why we should throw away so many of these misconceptions around catching people lying, but if you really think somebody is lying, one of the best things we can do is encourage them to talk more. He's also going to talk a lot about the power of empathy, which I know is a frequent topic, but he's going to get specifically into why it's not soft, it is strategic. He's also going to dive into the myth that people crack under pressure. They might crack, but that very often is not a good thing or a positive situation for us. This conversation is packed with knowledge and insight. Dave gives a bunch of takeaways and new considerations for us. I really appreciate you being here this week. Thank you so much. As always, let's take a quick minute and thank our sponsors. While you're online today, please check out humantel.com. Go over there, explore their catalog, and that's where you can start developing the skill set necessary to recognize when people's emotions are shifting by pinpointing changes in their facial expressions and nonverbal communication. When you choose the training program you want, enter the code INQUASIVE25 for 25% off the training of your choice. For the professional interviewers that are here for this conversation, please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. That's where you get all your questions answered and find out everything you need to know about joining and contributing to the International Association of Interviewers and qualifying for and earning your certified forensic interviewer designation. It's all there at certifiedinterviewer.com. And while you're online today, please check out inquasive.com. That's where you can learn more about the programs our clients ask us to custom facilitate for their senior leaders, sales teams, HR teams, and more to teach them the techniques necessary to uncover hidden value in all of their conversations. We really appreciate you being here this week for part 2 of our conversation with Dave, which once again started over on his Truth Be Told podcast. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I introduce to you Dave Thompson. What's up, dude?
How we doing?
Doing well. Funny to run into you here.
I just saw you, I think. You look just as good as you did 10 minutes ago.
You do as well, man. I gotta do my best when you're around. So for people who are like, wait a minute, how come they're opening up and they're just bantering? Let's give you a little of a backdrop here. So as you heard in the intro, we have my good friend Dave Thompson with us, and Dave is the host of the Truth Be Told podcast, and he was gracious enough to have me on as a guest on his show. And he was asking me to talk about some of the communication myths and tropes and misunderstanding that we see leaking into so many conversations and derailing them. So we just had that conversation over at Truth Be Told, and the link to that is in the show notes. So as we wrapped up that conversation, we started talking, we're like, well, wait, as we were doing that, Dave was coming up with his own ideas and his own list and things we wanted to talk about. And if I'm being really honest, I probably bullied that conversation a little bit and didn't give him a chance to say it all. So we jumped over here and we're going to do a companion episode to close the loop on this show to give Dave the opportunity to share with us a lot of the myths and tropes and misnomers and traps that he sees people falling into a lot in the world of investigative interviewing, but even beyond, and how we can all learn from it. So for people that don't know, because I didn't do a big extended intro, Dave and I are friends, colleagues. We've worked together for a long time. And if you didn't realize it or recognize his name, he was guest number 1 on the I See What You're Saying podcast. I thought it was very important to start off with somebody who's not only an expert in their field and has so much to share, but a good friend as well. So if you didn't listen to episode 1, go back and listen to that. But now we are here for, I probably should have looked this up, episode 131, I think is what this is going to be. So it only took me 130 episodes to invite you back. But now we're going to turn this over to you. This conversation is all about you, not about me. So in your world, you are at the tip of the spear for interview and interrogation on the research and science side. You're often giving testimony. You're in court. You're working with the Innocence Project. You're conducting investigative interviews. You're traveling the world teaching investigative interviews. What are some of the biggest myths or misnomers that you're seeing out there that are just hamstringing people's ability to build relationships and get the truth?
Well, I appreciate the intro. I've got so many things bubbling through my head. First of all, if you go back and listen to episode 1, we don't need the feedback. We know, we know. I mean, you've had 130 since then. I don't even want to know. I probably was 20 pounds lighter at that point. So maybe just listen to that episode. They don't have to watch it.
Just that much more to love, brother.
Yeah, that's true. But no, thanks for having me on then and now and being a great partner throughout. And it's kind of funny. I'm thinking, I wonder if this is how a therapist feels. Like, we were on the Truth Be Told show, and I'm sitting there listening to you rant about all these misconceptions that you have. And I'm there as the therapist, essentially, hearing you, but then thinking about all the problems that I have. And now I get to lay on the couch and you get to host that conversation. I wonder if therapists actually feel that way of like, man, it's not this garbage. You know what? Let's flip the tables. I'm going to talk for this session. That's what this feels like a little bit.
Well, maybe we need to find 2 guys who have podcasts and see if we can get some therapists on and ask them that question.
That's what we should do. Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things as we were going through it, I made this kind of comment at the end of our episode on Truth Be Told, is that we both like to talk a lot, right? We both have a lot of things to say. Of course, they're brilliant things that we want to say, but I think that we're also pretty good at knowing when to shut up. And what I mean by that is this misconception or this myth out there is that good communicators talk a lot. And you see that all often, like in a board meeting or at a conference or whatever, is the one person who tends to always have the microphone, or there is a conference meeting or team meeting, and they're the ones that always are talking. And maybe it's by the necessity of the role or the position. But sometimes in a conversation, when somebody's just dominating by talking, what they're not doing is listening or gaining any insight, right? When you're a good communicator, to me, especially in an investigative context, my whole goal is to get information that I don't already have. And so if I enter that conversation where I'm just going to talk as much as possible because I want to prove how smart I am, how credible my investigation is, how witty I can be in the way I present myself, I might sound great, but if my goal is to do a speech, then get on a stage. If my goal is to get information, then maybe I need to shut up and listen a little bit. And a shout out to Matt Halloran, who's one of my guests, who wrote a book, Shut the F Up and Listen. Incredible. The title pissed off some of my listeners, but great concept. I just think, as we were talking the last show, the more that we can stop talking, the better communicators we can be. So I don't know if you see the same in your space, but that one always just ticks me off when we just keep rambling on.
It does. I absolutely agree with you. I do see the same in my space. One of the things, or one of the many times where I have to try not to laugh out loud, is when somebody cuts me off to tell me what a great listener they are. But to your point, listening equals learning. If we're not learning, we're not listening. And I love how you said, if we're talking, we can't be learning. We can't be gathering insight. Now, there's I agree with you 100%. Maybe if someone's giving me some big reactions to what I'm saying, I can catalog those and those are important. But by and large, for the purpose of this conversation, you're 100% right. If we're doing all the talking, we're not learning. We're not gathering data. We're not gathering perspectives. We're not putting ourselves in a position to make better decisions. When we think about the term leader, that doesn't mean that you run the organization. A great interviewer is a great leader. They are facilitating that conversation. They're not just forcing it the whole time. People will perceive our value as leaders based on how well they perceive us as listeners or how strong they perceive us as listeners. Especially in the business world, a lot of leaders get to where they are because of their task experience. You were a great engineer, so now you run an engineering firm. You were great at marketing, so now you run a marketing firm, like all of these things. And that's okay. That's the way the world works. But your technical expertise and your leadership ability are two different things. It's true for me, it's true for you, it's true for everybody. And when it comes down to the actual leadership part of it, people will judge our leadership ability off of our listening ability. And I don't know how you feel about this, but being in a lot of rooms, listening to lots of people, give lots of presentations, talks, lead discussions, whatever. Oftentimes, to me, it comes off as the person who is bullying the conversation, over talking, often feels like they're doing it from a place of fear or lack of confidence. So they're trying to control the message. They're trying to control the time. They're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to limit the conversation. And when it comes off as coming from a place of fear or a place of insecurity or lack of confidence, the room can feel that. Where often the most successful leaders, the most confident leaders are the ones who are willing to sit back, let other people have the floor, potentially even give them credits for ideas. That's what I was going to say, but now I don't have to because it's already on the table. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, the energy is different. And I'm thinking if I had to call out, like, who are the people, who are my best friends, who are the people that I feel most comfortable sharing vulnerable information with, and why? Like, what do those conversations look like? And for me, those conversations look like they listen. Right. They give me the platform, and they're not just listening and just like we talked about this on the Truth Be Told episode, where you talked about like active listening is just performative. So they're not just listening of shaking their head, but they're good listeners, and that they're following up with questions and insight from what they just learned from me. And I've had, and everybody's probably experienced this, whether it's a date or a networking conversation or whatever, right? You're meeting somebody, you're one-on-one. When they dominate the entire conversation, it's draining. Like you're looking at your watch, you're hoping your phone goes off, you need some kind of reason to leave. Like it's, oh my God. And so that's not a good communicator just because they talk a lot. When they can ask you insightful questions and really have discipline in their listening when you're responding, and then ask you follow-up and then share a similar insight, that's when I think, man, that was a great conversation. Like I could have talked to that person for hours. That to me is a good communicator. And when I translate that into the investigative space, it's a different context, but the same thing is like, how draining is it for somebody who's coming to that conversation with something to lose, maybe a fear of consequence or embarrassment of what they're going to share, and all you do is talk the entire time? Like what is that going to do to my energy or my comfort level? And so that one just always gets me, is just when you're in a room or you're in a networking event, especially people developing in their career, you don't have to be the loudest person in the room. Be the most strategic person in the room. Be the person who's most interested in other people in the room. And that will make you a good communicator.
Amen. And to share a mistake, oftentimes if we are on a roll, it feels good. We're not necessarily trying to dominate the conversation. We're not necessarily trying to not give somebody another chance to talk or chance to be involved. It's just, I'm on a roll. This feels good. And if you are doing the traditional active listening, you're encouraging me to keep talking, even though in the back of your mind, you're like, I really wish this guy would shut up. But the cues you're giving me are, this is good. And because I love what I'm saying, I'm feeding off the cues. On the Truth Be Told episode, I gave a 30-second reference of a case I did where some guy had stole a few guns, and the kind of the strategic outcome that came from that. I felt great about that. I brought it back to our office. It was videoed, so I didn't bring the whole thing. I brought the video back to our office, and I sat down with Dave Zalosky, and I left with my ego in a bag when he watched that, because I talked way too much. I felt like I was on a roll. I felt like everything was working. I felt like he was giving me all the cues. So I just kept talking. When in reality, he was giving me all the cues, and I probably should have wound up what I was saying a smooth 8 minutes before I did. And I'm lucky the guy told me the truth and I didn't bore him out of it. So everything you're saying is 100% spot on. And maybe not just kind of that fear and insecurity piece, but sometimes it just feels good to get on a roll that if people are giving us those stereotypical active listening performative cues, we end up getting drawn into that cycle and don't even realize it. So learn from my mistakes.
I think that's good. Two last things with that, and then we can move on that you just said. So Dave Zalowski, I also give him credit. I think he was my first episode because that guy gave both of us the chance because of an organization they started 43 years ago now. But to me, one of Dave's greatest strengths as an interviewer was listening. And he, you could even just sit with him at lunch and he just did such a good job. It would be awkward if you didn't know him well, but he'd ask a question, you'd answer, and he'd just kind of smile and sit and allow that space. And you always feel like you have to fill that space. So he was really good at being a listener. The last thing with that is I was just thinking about, we were talking offline about editing podcasts, right? And so we have these conversations, we're cutting clips. For me, if I cut a clip from our show, the ones I'm most proud of or most like, okay, Dave, that was good. It's not when I said something that was great. It's when I asked a really good question and the other person was able to say something. But that's when I felt like, man, I'm a good communicator because I gave that other person this kind of perfect softball of a question where they could really share something. And that to me is how it should exist in every conversation. So anyway, that's number one for me, really, is just because you talk a lot doesn't mean you're good at doing so.
Not at all.
Yeah. Another one that I hear often, especially in recent years, because interrogation and the social science has really evolved the last few decades. And so there's been a movement away from kind of the confrontational type methods to evidence-based, science-based interviewing. And one of the big differences is this myth that like interrogations, what you see on Law and Order, interrogations must be confrontational. And if you have empathy, that means you're weak, right? The conversation's weak or soft. And I actually heard Lawrence Allison, who's an author of several of these research projects and the Orbit method, along with Emily Allison and a few others. And but he was on one of our webinars a few years ago, and he talked about how this concept of rapport and empathy, it's not being soft, it's being strategic, and it's allowing somebody the space to share something that they might not be comfortable sharing. And so a couple of things I got to talk about with this, because I think the myth, if you've never done an interrogation before, I know you've got a lot of listeners in the business and corporate world that are high performing executives. And if they were told, hey, you got to go talk to an employee who did something wrong, stole from you or your kid or whatever it might be, a lot of people just resort to what do they see on TV, or what does our human nature tell us is I'm just going to approach somebody and confront them. And I'm going to say, hey man, our video, our investigation shows that you committed this act, right? You stole money, you did whatever. I mean, unless you're really lucky or that person feels overwhelming guilt, more than likely their first response is going to be no, and probably with some cuss words around it. But it's me, no, what the hell are you talking about? I didn't do that. And so immediately when you confront somebody, you put them in a position of defensiveness, resistance. You've accused somebody, they're not going to like you right away. They're not going to like the conversation. It's kind of like walking into a sales meeting and the first thing you ask them to do is to pay versus talk to them for, I mean, it's silly. And so the first piece of this is confrontation is not the quickest way to get cooperation. You might get compliance, which is not what we want. We can talk about it later. The second piece is empathy. And, to me, empathy is not about saying what somebody did wrong is okay or justified or even minimize it from a consequence standpoint. Empathy is allowing somebody who may be uncomfortable to share that information, is giving them the space to do that and save face while they do so. That to me is not weak by any means. That's if you can get somebody to share something vulnerable to you in a private conversation, that takes some skill set. And to me, that's what that is.
It takes a huge skill set. It takes a level of, you talked about it, strategy, it takes a level of patience. It takes the ability to resonate and understand other people. There's a whole combination of skills that are in there. And thankfully, a perspective that I learned back when we were working together is that really our job was to talk to people who had made regrettable decisions. Who hasn't made a regrettable decision? Now,
Right.
thankfully, ours don't rise to the level of a lot of the people that we had to speak with, right? But we've all made regrettable decisions. So how hard is it to show empathy towards somebody who made a regrettable decision? That could be somebody who committed a crime. That could be somebody who maybe said something at work that they weren't supposed to say. That could be somebody who maybe made a decision in their personal life. We've all made regrettable decisions. So having empathy or compassion for that person doesn't make us soft. And to tie back to something we talked a lot about on your show, being outcome oriented. Well, if I need to encourage Dave to open up and share something vulnerable, probably something he's never told anybody else, well, then I need to be very strategic with how I do that, because he's certainly not just going to open up. I love what you said. The direct path is the path of most resistance. Let's just be honest about that. And I don't know how often this happens to you, but I used to, again, try not to laugh. The phone would ring. Hey, Mike, this is so-and-so from such and such company. We've got an investigation we really need your help with. Okay, cool. What's going on? Well, person did blah, 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 blah. Well, how are you so confident it was them and that's what happened? Well, we got them on video. Oh, no. Okay, so how'd the investigation go? Well, I showed them the video and they said it's not them. Safest bet in the history of time. Show somebody a video of them doing something wrong and set your watch to them saying, that ain't me. So the strategic approach, the empathetic approach, empathizing doesn't mean what you did is okay. It means that as a human being, we find ourselves in situations. I don't know about you. Actually, let me throw this out to you as a question. What percentage of the people that you've interrogated do you think would have made a different decision if they were in a different situation?
Yeah. Almost all of them.
99% of them.
Right. Yeah. 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 And you're right. It's not about saying what they did was right, because it even applies to witnesses, right? If you think about, and you talked about this on our episode on Truth Be Told, is you had a kind of a cool strategy of, before you're going to talk to somebody, is think about all the reasons they have to not cooperate with you or to not say yes to whatever it would be. Well, if we think about the same, let's just think about a witness to a crime. Right? Why don't they want to talk to me? Maybe it's because they don't have the information I think they have. So maybe they don't even have the information. If they do have the information, maybe they're afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of, maybe they're committing some kind of act of wrongdoing. They don't want to get investigated themselves. Maybe they just want to stay away from it. Maybe they don't want to point at the wrong person because they're not sure. Maybe they could be incriminated in some way in that same incident. And so when we think about all of those things and we approach the conversation, we should have empathy, not necessarily for what they did or didn't do, but also for why they are resistant to just talk to us in the situation. And that empathy could simply be they're in an office with us at their employer, and other people saw them come back in the office with us. We should have understanding that, hey, that's probably going to be uncomfortable. That person's probably going to have to explain to other people what they were doing back there. Let's understand where they're coming from. Because if I can't understand that, then the whole time in the conversation, they're thinking about, what am I going to tell my friends when I leave this room? And if that's what they're thinking about, they're not listening to you. And so, yeah, empathy to me is definitely a strategic approach to allow people to feel comfortable to share something that might be uncomfortable in doing so.
Amen. And I want to give you extra credit for talking about being empathetic towards the resistance to speak with you. All too often, I worry that people view resistance as disrespect. You don't respect me. You don't respect our values. You don't respect me as your parent, as your boss, as the organization, as your role, as your business development person, as your customer service support. You don't respect me. Therefore, you won't tell me. Resistance to open up and disrespect are not even related. It's possible that they could be disrespecting you. That's on the list of options. But far more often than not, they're resistant because they're worried about something else going on in their world, or that could go on in their world. And being cognizant of that's extremely important. So I want to give you extra credit for shouting that out, because that's super important.
I like that. Yeah, it's not about you. We talked about this a few different times. A lot of these, it's not about you. It's about their experience. And that whole thing you just said triggers another one for me, because what happens is when we're confrontational, or we start to feel like, hey, that person's being disrespectful to us, that's going to change our behavior. as interviewers, as questioners, as managers, leaders, whatever it might be. And this myth out there, and I talk about this ad nauseum. So people probably, if they've heard any of our stuff on Truth Be Told or from WZ, this misconception of liar, liar, and our pants start on fire or our noses grow when we're deceptive. It's just not true. And now behavior is important. We're going to talk about that, right? Like there's context there. It's interesting. Like if you and I are talking at a networking event and all of a sudden you keep looking at your watch or your phone, it's suggesting to me that you might have somewhere else to be. You're bored with me. You've got an appointment, a call you got to get on. So I'm going to pay attention to that. But the biggest misconception that's unfortunate because this is what people want to be trained on. But you observing somebody and they scratch their beard and they sneeze twice and they itch their right leg doesn't mean they're a liar. It might mean a bunch of things. Maybe they've got eczema. Maybe they got dry skin. Maybe they're nervous because they don't know what this conversation is about. Maybe they are lying, but we all too often classify it. And there's a few different things we can explore this. But the reason it triggered for me is our behavior can also impact their behavior. So if we take that last kind of concept of, all right, if I walk in the interview and I'm confrontational, or I don't give that person the platform to share or whatever, and they start to become, I perceive them as dishonest or disgruntled or hostile, well, now naturally I'm going to get frustrated. And everybody listening has been frustrated with talking to somebody who's not being cooperative. When you get frustrated, for me, my tone becomes sharper. My questions become more pointed. You can tell I'm a little pissed off or withdrawn. That's not good, right? These are all bad things to do. But when I do that, naturally that's going to impact somebody else's behavior. And too often we've got these like horse blinders on that I'm not recognizing what I'm doing. I'm just seeing what they're doing. And so because I'm becoming a jerk, they're becoming more resistant, and I'm interpreting that as defensive and being untruthful, and it was my fault in the first place. And so there's a lot we can spend some time on this of variables that impact people's behavior, but I'll throw that back to you to see what you think. But to me, that's a big one, is let's get away from this myth that just because somebody's behavior changed means that they're a liar.
Oh, dude, do we have 2 more hours? I agree with everything that you just said, not surprisingly, and sort of 2 different tracks there. I forgot, I tried this once on your show and it didn't go well. So let's see if I can remember both tracks on this show and keep them straight.
Right. Yeah, we're getting old. We got to take notes now because our cognitive load is,
too much. You're 100% right. Single factor decisions are deadly. So if somebody's saying they scratch their nose, they look to the left, they scratch their beard, they cross their arms, whatever, that could mean thousands of different things depending on the context of the situation that it happened in. So you're right. That is what so many people want to be trained on. I'm sure you get this a lot. What's the one behavior I need to look for? What's the one question I need to ask? That hack mentality. Even if there was one behavior that you had to look for or one question you had to ask, if you can't set it up, if you can't get there, if you can't transition out of it, it's useless for you anyway. So and I know that you're in the same boat. When it comes to the verbal and nonverbal communication piece, we should never be looking for truth or lie. And I feel confident saying never there. And it's a word we should probably avoid, but there, I think I'm going to stick with it for now. We should be looking for comfort and discomfort. And you've seen this, I know, where somebody all of a sudden gets super comfortable because it's a situation they've been in a bunch before, and they can lie their face off and feel really good about it. And I know you've been in situations before where the person telling you the truth is super uncomfortable because this is novel to them. So they have the emotional roller coaster that they're riding. The one that I think I want, especially this audience, that I really want to call people's attention back to is it was our fault to begin with. So often we get frustrated, upset, angry, that disrespect label gets thrown out, that not listening label gets thrown out. When somebody is reacting and responding to us without getting all Tai Chi, they can feel our energy. They're reading our facial expressions. They're looking at our posture. They can see when we roll our eyes or when we take a deep breath or when we sit back or we cock our head to the side. They can see all that. In fact, if it's a superior-subordinate relationship, you can bet that the subordinate is more hyper-focused on the superior's behavior than the superior is on the subordinate's behavior, because the subordinate has more to lose, has more to be afraid of. They're in a more vulnerable position. And unfortunately, that subordinate has likely been exposed to many of the same myths we've been talking about for an hour and a half now across 2 shows. So they're making potentially misinformed or half-informed decisions, and we're feeding them that. So if we use like the car analogy, once you redline, you can't come back down. You just blew up the motor. You're done. We can always crank the temperature up a little bit if we have to and leave room to come back down. But at the start of every conversation, we should be using professionalism, friendliness, care and concern as a strategic advantage to put us in position to move forward, as opposed to forcing authority on somebody right out of the gate. At best, we'll come back to this eventually. You said it, that gets compliance. At worst, we shut somebody down. So both avenues that you took there are probably worthy of 60-minute conversations on their own.
Yeah, there's a couple last things I've got with this one, because again, I could speak to this forever, but the concept of how we impact their behavior, it's also this bias of whether it's an investigation or it's a business conversation, you often have some type of insight about the person you're about to talk to. So speaking to your audience is, let's say I'm gonna have a sales meeting, or I'm gonna go meet somebody at a networking event, and before I do that, I'm talking to one of my peers who referred that person to me. So somebody, Mike, tells me, hey, I really want you to meet, Sarah at this meeting, and she's great. You're going to love her. She's super bubbly. She's funny, really easy to talk to. Well, and then you tell me, and I also want you to meet John, who works for whoever. And the guy's really dry. It's hard to get him to say anything, really quiet. Now, always be yourself, right? However, and everybody should resonate with this, you're going to enter both of those conversations in a different mindset. I'm going to walk in thinking, okay, Sarah, she seems like she's going to be fun. I could probably make a joke. I can be jovial, whatever. By being that way, it's probably easier for her to reciprocate that same behavior. And so now she comes across fun and happy and jovial and affirms the referral that I was given earlier. When I go talk to Johnny or whoever, and I walk in and I'm nervous and apprehensive because I was told this guy's really hard to talk to. And so that means maybe I don't come in with a joke, or I don't come in with high energy, and I come in, actually match him where I think he's going to be. He's probably going to do the same thing and are going to reciprocate. And so now both people, who knows what they actually are like? It's possible that both of their behaviors are a direct replication of the energy I brought to the conversation. And so now I think it's important, right? You want to have as much context about somebody as possible and be situationally aware to how to kind of interact with each person. But too often we enter a conversation with a presumption of how that person's going to be. We act that way. We confirm that bias. And now that we walk away and be like, you're right, Sarah was great to talk to, or you're right, Johnny didn't want to say a dang word to me, when in fact it was our fault the whole time. So be aware of that, right? Any type of conversation. And then the last piece with this behavioral thing I have, and this example I've used a few times, but to me, it makes it really simple. From an investigative standpoint, and even in the corporate world, if you have a human resources, employee relations issue, and you've got like a sexual harassment case, we'll just say, and you have, a victim who was harassed or discriminated against or whatever, you've got a witness who maybe observed that behavior, and then you have the alleged wrongdoer who committed that behavior, and you interview all three separately. It's possible all three demonstrate the same physical behaviors, right? All three might cross their arms, might be fidgety, might avoid eye contact, might get flushed in the face. And our bias is to think, well, of course, the victim did that because they're probably nervous or embarrassed. The witness did that because they're nervous about getting involved. And the alleged wrongdoer did that because they're lying to me. And what we did is same exact behavior from everybody. We walked in already with a bias to assume what that behavior represented. And so I just, to drive that point further home, behavior is important to pay attention to contextually. Like, is somebody not listening anymore? Have I lost them in the conversation? But our goal is to obtain information, and we can do that. If you want to know if somebody is lying, get them to talk more, right? Get information from them versus just make these assumptions. So that's my soapbox on behavior, unless you had anything else to say to that piece.
No, I'm going to leave you with that one, man. I love it all. If you think someone's lying, let them talk more.
Yeah.
Don't cut them off. Don't accuse them of being a liar. I love it. Let them talk more.
Yeah. The research really shows around physical behavior, just to drop this for the audience, that, our ability to actually detect deception based off physical behavior is at like 50 to 55% accuracy, which means you can flip a quarter. What the research does show is a better way to detect deception is to withhold information and see if people contradict that. So strategically use evidence or information that you have, or to try to get as much information as somebody and look at how many verifiable facts they're giving you that you can go either corroborate or disprove. So yeah, if you want to figure out if somebody's lying to you, get them to talk. So let's talk about that. But another thing that kind of annoys me is this concept. And again, this kind of goes to old school interrogation, or if you're a Law and Order fan, which I am a Law and Order fan. It's just not a training video. This is drama to watch. But is this concept that like only guilty people and then insert blank. So anything that first of all identifies only guilty people do this. But one of them is like guilty people crack under pressure. And I've heard this from investigators, detectives. I've heard it in testimony where there was a case in, I shouldn't give the jurisdiction. There was a case where the investigator testified that, I observed this person. This is a homicide case. I observed this person in the interview room and described their behavior, which we just talked about as a problem, and described their behavior as being allegedly deceptive. And they said, I could tell this person just wanted to give it up. They just needed to be beat. They just needed to be cracked, right? They just needed somebody. And this concept of cracking under pressure. So the truthfulness to this is, yes, people do crack under pressure. Innocent or guilty, people have no idea what you're talking about. Anybody could falsely provide information given the right context. So that's a fact. Our goal, and I think this to me translates directly to the sales piece. Our goal is to get cooperation, not compliance. And if you think about those two things, whether you're talking about your kids or an investigation or a colleague or whatever, compliance is short-lived. Compliance may not be, you could get somebody to do a task for you, but if they don't like the way that like they're doing it unwillingly, they're going to take shortcuts. They're going to do something that they're not supposed to do. They're going to falsify it, whatever it is. One of the types of false confessions are compliant false confessions, because people are just complying with the investigator because that's the only option they feel like they have. We're looking more so at cooperation. And so when you think about the end of this, and I'll let you kind of expand on it from your perspective, but if we're just trying to put pressure on somebody to close a deal or to get information, you might get the result that you think you want. You might get that. And then you feel like, check, that was successful. That's not the right result. It's not reliable. That's probably a deal that's going to fall through. That's a deal that they said, yeah, I'm going to sign on the dotted line. And then 2 days later, you get the, sorry, I couldn't actually do that. And that's a confession that you might get today and then realize tomorrow that wasn't really accurate. So yeah, this concept, guilty people crack under pressure. I want to get away from not only from that myth, but from that strategy.
Both quickly, please. Yeah. The whole point, like when I was writing notes, like guilty people crack and putting that in like quotation marks, because cracking can mean so many different things. If to your point about compliance versus cooperation, which is genius, if somebody says, fine, I'll do it, you're losing.
Right.
Because what they really just told you is this conversation is over. Like that's what they just told you. And they might do something related to the task that you asked them to do. But the time, the detail, the quality, the dedication, the follow-up, all those things, you can just kiss goodbye. And there's probably going to be a higher level of resentment because of how they ended up there. So I love that one for sure. And when we think about it, I want to kick this back around to you in just a second, so do not let me forget, and talk more about coerced compliant confessions and what they mean. Because take this into business for a moment, and even into our personal lives. We all have a stress or BS or annoyance threshold that we're willing to hold, that we're willing to level up to in any conversation. So if I'm thinking about the person I'm talking to, where this conversation is taking place and what we're talking about, there's a certain level of discomfort, BS, annoyance I'm willing to tolerate. And that might be higher or lower depending on those three factors. But once I get to that saturation point, I'm out. And whatever I have to say or do to get out is what I'm going to say or do to get out. And depending on who I'm talking to, that might mean I have to give you what I think you want in order to get out of here. In investigations, that gets super dangerous. Turn it back to you in just a second. In business, It's dangerous, not necessarily when people going to jail for 50 years for a crime they didn't commit, but it's dangerous because now we assume we have understanding. We assume we have cooperation. We assume we're on the same page. We assume things are going to get done. When in fact, you have somebody who's walking away with a giant exhale going, oh, thank God that's over. And they're putting that misery behind them. Trauma with the littlest T, right? That was miserable. I'm through with that. They're moving on. Meanwhile, we're sitting behind our desk going, good, they got it. And there's a complete disconnect between the two. Can you please dive into, and you can take this, you can do all three, coerced confessions, take it whatever angle you want. But I think specifically thinking about the business audience, we're probably more likely to run into analogous coerced compliance false statements than coerced internalized false statements. So really understanding for investigative and business audiences what that means, where that comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. This one's a big platform soapbox for me. So if people want to learn more, find me. I'll be happy to talk about it. And I will say, not to promote the Truth Be Told show, but I have to say I had Amanda Knox on one of the episodes, and anytime I talk about the false confessions, I can talk about it. You can read research about it. You can watch a documentary about it. But when you actually hear from somebody who's falsely confessed or been wrongly convicted, that's when you can really experience what that's like. And so I'll hit those real quick. But for your audience, what you just said, I mean, I can, again, think about sitting at a car dealership, the simplest kind of sales, obvious example. But the amount of times I'm sitting there or have sat there at the little cubicle and I'm like at the point where either it's taken too long or I can't stand the person's personality or they're too pushy or whatever it is, but there's no way to leave, right? Some people just have the ability to say, you know what, I'm done for the day, like whatever. I have this, it's uncomfortable. It's like leaving a party early. It's like, oh, how do we say goodbye? How do we get out of here? And in that setting, it's like, what can I say to that salesperson that's making it easy to leave? And it's not going to be, hey, I'm not interested and I'm leaving. It's going to have to be, you know what, let me go talk to my significant other, or let me talk to my parents, or, you know what, I really like this, but I'm running late for work, so I'll call you back later. And it's something that's not true, right? It's some way to get out of the conversation and get that relief, go back to safety. The three types of false confessions, at least the way the researchers have kind of categorized these, one of them is a voluntary false confession. So this is where somebody, just comes forward without really any pressure from law enforcement and confesses to something they didn't do. So this one probably happens the least frequent and is actually the most scrutinized. And in your space, people can resonate with this. This would be like an inbound call where somebody immediately not a loyal return customer. They just call you up and they want to make a purchase right away without any kind of due diligence. Like your spidey senses should go off. Wait a second, right? What's going on here? And so there's a great Netflix documentary that gives you an example of this called The Confession Killer, about Henry Lee Lucas, who was down in Texas, who confessed to 350, 400 homicides or something, maybe committed two. But the notoriety of it, the excitement behind it, he was on cover of Time magazine or whatever it was, most notorious serial killer. So that's voluntary false confession. We tend to scrutinize those anyway. The two that are more common and more because of something we have done are both these compliant type of false confessions. One is internalized compliant and one is coerced compliant, which I'll spend more time on because I think you said that's more relevant. Internalized means people leave that interview or within that interview actually come to the belief that they did commit whatever that crime was. And which seems crazy, right? But in that conversation, they're basically being told whatever their story is isn't true. The investigator's not accepting a denial, not accepting an ulterior or alternative story or alibi. And they're being told, usually, we have evidence that you did it. We've got video that you did it. Your DNA is there. 3 witnesses told us that you did it. And you know what? If you don't remember doing it, it's probably because you were blackout drunk. It's probably because you were under the influence. It's probably because you did it when you were asleep and delirious when you woke up and did it. And so they create this kind of excuse for why the person doesn't remember committing that crime. And so there have been documented false confession, wrongful conviction cases where a person confesses to a terrible crime, homicide, or sexual assault, rape, arson, where it was later found out they didn't do it, but they came to believe they actually did because of that. The one that's probably more prevalent in your space, if we make the translation, is coerced compliant, And we think about compliant versus cooperation. So this means the person felt like they had no other choice but to comply. The only way to leave that interrogation room, to leave that sales conversation, is just to comply with the person. The coerced part is because that's what incentivizes them to do it. And oftentimes it's suggestions of consequences if they don't comply. It can be suggestions of leniency if they do comply. It could be the use of false evidence, leading questions, those types of things. And that's the one where I go back to the car sales kind of example, where I know I'm not going to buy the car. So I'm not internalizing like, okay, I'm actually thinking I'm going to buy it. I know I'm not going to buy this car from this person. I don't want this deal. I don't know how to get out of this conversation. So yeah, I'm going to give the guy my cell phone number, my email address, and tell him I'll come back tomorrow just so I can leave the conversation. That's the false confession there. It could also happen, and I've had this plenty, where you have somebody who's maybe not the decision maker, but the only way to leave the conversation with the salesperson is to get as close to a decision as possible. Yep, I'll follow up with my boss. I think we can do this. We can pull this off. I'm super excited. Send me the proposal. You put it in your pipeline as like a really warm or hot lead. And that person the whole time was like, there's no way this can happen, but I don't know how I was going to get off the phone. So I think there's a really great translation, and we could spend a ton of time on it, but between those categories into a sales piece, because really that's all it is. It's a high pressure conversation.
And high pressure conversations typically lead to negative outcomes. If we want somebody to share vulnerable information, if we want them to accept our idea, if we want them to change their behavior, pressure might lead them to a decision quicker, but it's not going to be a decision they've aligned their self-image with, all the problems you've already illustrated. You mentioned sales a couple times. Often on the sales side, people will reflect on a deal that they thought was going to go through and didn't. And they'll come back with, well, I guess I didn't build a sense of urgency. We don't need to build a sense of urgency if value carries the day. We generally have to build a sense of urgency. If the value isn't there, then we might feel like we need to put pressure on to push them across the line. And another huge mistake there is we usually do pressure from our standpoint, not pressure from what's important to them, because during the discovery phase, which is really the investigative interviewing phase, we weren't trying to gain information we didn't already have, which was the very first goal you talked about in this conversation. But when we think about society's norms, like you mentioned that there are some people just stand up and say, I'm done. But I know that in almost any conversation, if I stand up and say, I'm done, you have responses ready for that. If it's sales, you're trying to keep me in the room. If it's a leader, it's you can't walk out of my office. If it's a parent, don't turn your back on me or you won't have your iPad for the next 365 days. There's responses for that. So society's norms have taught us that it's rude, it's impolite. There'll be consequences for me if I tell the truth. So what I need to do is find an alternative that's acceptable within our norms that will get me out of here without any real or implied consequences, which leads to the perfect analogy, and I'm so happy you brought it up, of these coerced complied confessions or statements. I've had enough of whatever I'm experiencing. I'm going to give you what I think you want so I can get out of here. And you've mentioned multiple times during this conversation, it was our fault to begin with. It was our behavior. It was something we did. It was the pressure that we turned up. I can't tell you how many times, and maybe we can go on this tangent for a minute if you want, or any tangent that you want to, the number one step to truly building rapport, demonstrating empathy, and getting somebody to change their mind or sharing vulnerable information is to turn the temperature down, is to slow down, is to dial back the pressure, is to make it feel like a regular conversation between two people. Because as soon as people feel that pressure, I guess I'll geek out for half a second. I'll throw Paul Zach's name out there. I'll throw his book in the show notes. But when he and his team did all their research that led to the publication of The Trust Factor, along with a whole bunch of other work that they do, one of the things that they cite is that when we experience trust, our brains produce oxytocin. But when we experience higher levels of stress, our brains produce cortisol, and cortisol is an oxytocin inhibitor. So literally, as stress levels rise, our brain begins to shut down and become more defensive, and we're not open to these vulnerable and trusting conversations and moments. So there might be an argument to be made that sometimes you do need to turn the heat up a little bit. But that will never work. Here, I'm using never again. If we started with the temperature too high to begin with, we're taking that potential tool, as risky as it is, out of our toolbox. So I'll now summarize and turn back to you, because clearly I'm ranting again with too many self-decided important things to say. Start by turning the temperature down to really get the outcomes that we need.
No, I think I'm glad you did that, because it's helpful to translate. I think the last thing with this, and I got one, I think, pet peeve that probably summarizes all of mine into one that I can wrap us up with. But one of the big differences, right, when from my world and your kind of former world, we're talking about interviews, interrogations, we need reliable information, right? We like a quick sale is not, that's dangerous. I mean, that's life impacting. I will say, when you talked about like create urgency, the value should carry. I like that a lot. For people that are listening to you, when you believe in your product and your service and there's high value and you want long-term relationships, everything we're saying is what you should be listening to. I think it's probably different if your goal is to go on TikTok and sell some kind of knockoff product that all you want to do is create urgency so people buy it in the next 30 seconds, but you give zero blanks if that product is good, reliable, valuable, and you don't think that customer's coming back anyway. You're just looking for mass, right? That to me is the interrogator who doesn't care if the confession's reliable, going to stand up in court and do whatever. They just want a high confession count. And so for those of you that are listening that are proud in your company and your product and your service, that's what we're talking about. It's the same thing an investigator should be. So that to me, I mean, we went a while on that, but this concept of what position we're putting people in is really going to impact your outcome. So you want me to hit my last one?
Go, dude.
We talk about outcome, and it's funny because this myth or misconception or frustration is about the outcome, but it's really, if we can change this, we can change the way we conduct an entire conversation from the beginning. And if I were to ask most people, and even ask your listeners, if I just was on right now with anybody listening to this, and I just asked you, what is the goal you think of an interrogation? Most people listening would say, well, probably to get a confession, right? To get an admission, to get somebody convicted, prosecuted, terminated, whatever it might be. And that misconception needs to change. It's not just a misconception. It was a strategy, right? That was the goal in most people's minds. That's how a lot of people were trained. If we can change the goal from to get a confession, and in your world, it's to close a deal. If instead we can translate that to the goal of this conversation is to get as much reliable information as possible. It's to build a relationship, right? Depending on the context, we can get to that end game of maybe closing a deal, maybe getting incriminating information. But if we change the goal, we change the process. And if I walk into a conversation where I know, or I'm walking in thinking, I need this person to tell me they did it. Well, that's the hardest thing for somebody to say. So when they're not saying I did it, I'm going to get frustrated. I'm going to become coercive. All the things we already talked about. If my goal is you better close this deal with this person and I'm not closing the deal, I'm going to get frustrated. Same thing. And that person I'm talking to is going to know my goal is to close the deal. And I know that this car sales thing is the most simple example of sales, but it's just an easy one to use. If their goal is just to sell me today, and maybe they do make up for it. Maybe it works. Maybe I made a coerced compliant purchase, right? And so I buy the car because I was under pressure. I had to make a decision today, and they did a good job. But let's say I couldn't stand the way they treated me. That's the last time I'm buying a car from that person and that dealership. And this is longer term thinking, right? But if I'm running that dealership, I would rather that customer didn't buy the car today, but I really like the way that salesperson treated me. I like the information they gave. I like their follow-up. When I am ready to buy a car, I'm calling up that person. I'm telling my sister to call that person. I'm telling every friend that's looking for a car to call that person. And so the goal for me of an interview or of a conversation is, how can I build a sustainable relationship? Not that you're going out to coffee with your suspect, but can this person be cooperative with me maybe long term? And how can I get reliable, actionable information, whether they confess or not? Even, you said this earlier, even if somebody lied to me about everything that they did, but they gave me a full alibi that's a lie, I can do something with that. If my goal is just a confession and we get into a did not, did to, I can't do anything with that information. So I'm always thinking about what's next. So change the goal, and I think you change the process. That's my final words with that one.
That's genius. And you've changed the title of this episode like 7 times. And I think we're going to end with that one. Change the goal, change the process. We got there in the end. But that's genius. And you're 100% right. When we change the goal, we change what we're focused on. And when we change what we're focused on, we change the steps we take to achieve that. And sometimes people might say, well, a confession and the truth is the same thing. Not necessarily. They might end up being the same thing, but they could very well be 2 different things. And you're right, the emotions that we feel based on the roadblocks we run into on our way to our alleged goals all play such a role. That's genius. Change the goal, change the process, and our goal should be get as much reliable, actionable information as possible. And actionable doesn't necessarily mean, to your point, that it's what we wanted. It gives us another avenue. It gives us another way. To use maybe another surface level analogy, you and I are old enough to remember needing to read maps to get places. So if you gave me a map and said you need to get from Buffalo to Pittsburgh, I can look at that and I can start choosing what's probably the best route, the fastest route, alternative routes. So now all of a sudden, if I'm running into traffic, I got ideas in my head. For most of us now, we just punch the address into the GPS and we go. We don't think about it. And from a conversational standpoint, going for the confession can be like just following the GPS. And now I'm stuck in traffic. Now I'm sitting here. Now I'm angry. Now I'm running late. Now I'm upset. Well, I didn't do anything to pre-plan my route to get an idea of what time of day is it? What roads am I taking? Is there construction? What might the GPS not know that I have to plan around? So that whole map versus GPS, as long as we're getting, if you want to hook their line, keep them talking, get actionable information, change the goal, change the process. Dude, in about another hour, I think we're probably getting close to that now. You packed a whole ton of knowledge, experience, and perspective that not only applies in the investigative interview world, but it applies to our world outside of that room as well. Because if you think about our personal relationships, our business relationships, our investigative relationships, how much time do we spend trying to get information from people to achieve a goal?
Right.
Pretty much all day long.
Yeah. Right. Well, I appreciate you having me on to talk about it. And that last piece is like, your reputation is going to carry with you through every company. Especially if you're in sales, you're going to deal with the same customers all the time. Customers are going to move to different companies. Like, and this from our industry, shared industry, like it's small, no matter the industry that you're in. And so if you are not listening to what we're talking about, it's not just going to impact one conversation. This could impact your whole career. And yes, metrics are important, especially in the sales world. You want to have results, but I think these are the most effective ways to get there. So my only last thing is my ask is, well, listen to all of your ranting back on the Truth Be Told episode for your misconceptions. I think those were great takeaways. And if you listen to these, is don't just listen to another episode and go on about your day. Change your mindset, right? Take at least one of these things and think, how can I be a better communicator tomorrow? And then I think both of us feel like we've done our job, is hopefully people can actually implement some of these changes that we came up with.
For sure. Change your goals. Change your goals. What are you really trying to achieve with it? Yeah. I love it. We'll put the show notes. We'll put the link to your show in the show notes for sure. People should be following you. They should be learning from you, regardless of their industry. It doesn't make a difference. So where should people go to not only find the Truth Be Told podcast, but to follow you online so they can learn as much from you as possible?
Perfect. Thank you. truthbetoldpodcast.com is easy place to go for all of those. Real active on LinkedIn. So there's a few Dave Thompsons out there, but if you throw CFI, so Certified Forensic Interviewer, that'll help you find it. And then our training firm is just w-z.com for Wickland and Zalowski. But yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for spreading the good word, and we'll do the same on our side.
I appreciate it, brother. We'll have all those links in there. We'll work it out. This episode will come out 1 week after yours, I promise. So if you came over here after listening to Truth Be Told, thank you so much. We appreciate you stopping by. It was worth every minute listening to what Dave had to say. And if you just listened to this episode first, now that you've listened to Dave, please hit the link below. Go to the Truth Be Told podcast. You can listen to the front half of this conversation where the script was flipped and we talk through more of the myths and miscommunication opportunities that came from my perspective based on the business world coming from the investigative interviewing world. Brother, it is always great to see you. Thank you so much for sharing the time with us today. I can't wait to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Always a good time.
Take care, man. Dave, thank you for 2 awesome conversations. That was a lot of fun. I'm glad we got to spend that time together. Glad we got to explore the myths and misconceptions, but most importantly, how to overcome them and what the better alternatives are across a wide range of conversations. Yes, investigative interviewing, but sales, leadership, even the parenting references are all so important. Dude, you said so many great things in this conversation. Change your goal and change the process was genius. I love that one. I also think it's really important for people to realize that the goal should be to get more actionable information than we already have. Turns into data points, should create better decisions, which should drive better outcomes for us. Get more information. Thank you for busting the lying myths. Thank you for busting the cracking under pressure myths. I think those are very important conversations that need to be had and so much more. It's always great to talk to you, brother. Thank you for being here. And of course, thank you to everybody that took the time to join us for another episode. We really appreciate you being here week after week. Thank you so much. Please, while you're here, take a quick second, subscribe to the show, like the show, share it with your network, and please leave us your feedback. We really would love to hear from you. And while you're online today, just take a quick moment to check out our sponsors. Head over to humantel.com. That's where you can explore their research online, choose the training program that's best for you, and start the process of developing the skill necessary to understand what people are likely thinking and feeling at any moment by recognizing shifts in their facial expressions and nonverbal communication. While you're there, enter the code INQUASIVE25 for 25% off the training of your choice. For the professional interviewers, please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com. That's where you can get all your questions answered about both the International Association of Interviewers and the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation. Everything you need to know is right there at certifiedinterviewer.com. And finally, while you're online today, please check out inquasive.com. That's where you can learn more about the programs that our clients ask us to facilitate for their senior leaders, sales teams, HR teams, and more to teach them the techniques necessary to uncover hidden value in all of their high impact conversations. And for this week, one more, head over to the Truth Be Told podcast. That's where you can listen to the first half of this conversation where Dave interviews me. You can put the 2 pieces together for the full picture. And you can also follow Dave and the great interviews and great guests he has over there. Thank you so much for being here for another week. We appreciate it. Stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.